I didn't cry when my daughter-in-law forgot my birthday again. I didn't argue either when she sent me a $3,000 invoice for a yacht party I hadn't even been invited to. I simply opened my banking app, transferred her exactly $1, and wrote 5 words in the memo line, "I am not on board." Then I started shutting down every account they had been using under my name. Before we continue, welcome back to the Quiet Revenge Stories channel. If you enjoy real-life family drama, quiet revenge stories, and powerful lessons about self-respect and boundaries, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now let's get back to what happened next. I haven't really done big birthday celebrations since my husband passed away 8 years ago. Honestly, my favorite way to spend the day is in total peace and quiet, with a perfectly brewed cup of coffee and a slice of homemade plum pie. I learned a long time ago not to hold my breath when it comes to other people, especially my son Harrison and his ultra-business-minded wife Julianne. When my 67th birthday arrived on an ordinary Tuesday in October, and the two of them completely ignored it, the oversight stung at first, but I kept my mouth shut, swallowed the hurt, and went about my day. Exactly 1 week later, I was sitting at my usual kitchen table in my cozy brick house outside Portland, Maine, when a new email from Julianne appeared in my inbox. The subject line was short transactional and cold invoice Harrison's yacht party. Attached was a detailed PDF requesting exactly $3,000 billed directly to me under a bold category labeled Family Contribution Share. Julianne had included a brief note explaining that after such a stressful year at work, Harrison deserved a truly special celebration, and that all family members would naturally be splitting the cost of a private yacht charter along the autumn coastline. I opened the attachment and reviewed the itemized expenses without saying a word. There were charges for gourmet seafood catering a professional DJ brought in from Boston and custom nautical decorations. When I reached the final page and examined the complete guest list, however, I noticed that my name wasn't included anywhere. They wanted my money to pay for the yacht, but they had absolutely no intention of having me aboard. In that moment, I didn't cry, and I didn't feel the crushing disappointment I might have expected. Instead, a cold clarity settled over me. I realized that to them, I was no longer a mother or a grandmother. I'd become an ATM with a heartbeat. Rather than calling Julianne and starting a fight, I logged into my online banking, transferred exactly $1 to the account listed on the invoice, and typed 5 words into the memo field, "I am not on board." After setting my phone aside, I looked through the kitchen window and watched the autumn wind strip colorful leaves from the old oak trees in the backyard. I knew that single dollar was going to trigger a chain reaction in my son's life, but I was finally ready to take the first step. The transfer itself was only the beginning. The real work started later that evening when I sat down at my desk. For years, most of the family's shared subscriptions accounts and financial conveniences had been connected to my name. I had arranged things that way long ago when Harrison was just getting started in his career and money was tight. At the time, it felt like helping my son build a stable future. Somewhere along the way, however, temporary assistance had quietly transformed into permanent entitlement. I opened my laptop, switched on the desk lamp, and began reviewing every automatic payment line by line, relying on the same attention to detail I had developed during my years as a professional bookkeeper. The first expenses I targeted were the weekly organic grocery deliveries Julianne routinely sent to her house without ever thinking about who was paying for them. After that came the premium music and streaming subscriptions, where every family profile was connected to my credit card, followed by the gas card I had originally given Harrison for emergencies, but which had somehow become his everyday fuel budget. Without hesitation, I changed every password and redirected all 2-factor authentication to my personal phone. I canceled the authorized user card attached to my credit account, the same card Julianne treated as her own during trips to boutique bakeries and beauty supply stores. I didn't contact lawyers, make threats, or involve authorities. I simply removed my name from the financial foundation they had come to depend on. The feeling was strange, a mixture of grief and relief that seemed to grow with every click of the mouse, but my hands never shook. I loved my family, yet I had also spent years teaching them that my generosity had no limits. At exactly 10 o'clock that night, I sent a short message to the family group chat. As of right now, all accounts and cards under my name have been restricted to my personal use. Please make alternative arrangements. I didn't mention my forgotten birthday, and I didn't bring up the outrageous yacht invoice. After placing my phone face down on the nightstand, I went to bed knowing the fallout had already begun. By then, streaming services were probably cutting off in the middle of someone's favorite show. Grocery purchases were failing at checkout counters, and the financial safety net they took for granted had quietly disappeared. The next morning would bring the first wave of consequences. The fallout arrived exactly as quickly as I expected. The next morning, my phone began vibrating across the wooden nightstand while I was pouring my first cup of coffee in the kitchen. Notifications appeared one after another, first from Julianne, then from Harrison, followed by a lengthy voicemail that I had no interest in listening to. Their messages all carried the same tone of outrage, not because they were worried about me, but because the conveniences they had taken for granted had suddenly disappeared. "What is the meaning of this?" Julianne demanded in a text written almost entirely in capital letters. My grocery order was declined at checkout. A few minutes later, Harrison sent a message of his own. "Mom, my gas card isn't working. I'm stuck at the station and had to pay cash. Please fix this right now. I'm already late." Not one message asked how I was doing. Nobody mentioned my birthday, and nobody seemed remotely concerned about the fact that they had just sent me a bill for a party I wasn't even invited to attend. The only thing they noticed was the moment the financial doors closed and they were forced to deal with the consequences themselves. Rather than responding, I spent the morning in my sunroom repotting several hibiscus plants that had become root-bound over the summer. The work required patience and concentration, and I found the process far more enjoyable than engaging in another circular family argument. Around noon, however, I heard a car pull into the driveway, followed by a door slam loud enough to echo through the yard. I knew who it was before he even reached the front porch. Harrison entered without knocking and marched straight into the kitchen. His face was flushed, his jaw was tight, and he still had his car keys clenched in one hand. "What is going on with you, Mom?" he demanded as he dropped into a chair. "Julianne is losing her mind, and I just had to pay for gas with my own money." I washed the soil from my hands, dried them carefully, and sat down across from him. "I gave you that card years ago for emergencies, Harrison," I said calmly. "It wasn't meant to fund your daily routine or support Julianne's lifestyle." He stared at me in disbelief. "You're seriously doing all of this because we forgot one birthday?" That statement told me everything I needed to know. In his mind, the issue wasn't years of entitlement, the yacht invoice, or the complete absence of respect. He had reduced everything to a forgotten birthday card because acknowledging the larger problem would have required him to confront his own role in it. "That's not what this is about," I replied. "Then what is it about?" he shot back. I leaned forward slightly. "The two of you sent me a bill for $3,000 to pay for a yacht party I wasn't invited to attend. You expected me to cover the cost of your celebration while leaving my name off the guest list entirely. If you honestly don't understand why that's a problem, then we're discussing two completely different realities." For a brief moment, he looked caught off guard. "That had to be a mistake," he said quickly. "Julianne probably forgot to add your name when she printed the list. Of course you were supposed to come." The explanation sounded weak even to him. Julianne was many things, but careless wasn't one of them. She planned every social event with military precision, especially when appearances and money were involved. The idea that she had somehow forgotten the mother expected to contribute thousands of dollars was absurd. I met his eyes and said nothing. The silence forced him to sit with his own explanation. Eventually, he looked away first. "The accounts stay closed," I said firmly. "That decision isn't changing." His expression hardened immediately. "You know, if you keep acting like this, you're going to end up completely alone in this house." The words were intended to hurt me. Years earlier, they probably would have. Now they simply sounded sad. "The loneliness started long before today," I replied quietly. He stood up, frustrated that I wasn't reacting the way I used to, and headed toward the front door. A moment later, the heavy door slammed behind him, rattling the glass in the entryway. After he left, I remained seated for several minutes, listening to the silence settle back over the house. There was no triumph in what had happened. If anything, I felt disappointed that our relationship had reached a point where basic respect required such drastic measures. Eventually, I stood up, walked into my office, and pulled a blue binder from the cabinet beside my desk. Inside, I began organizing bank statements, screenshots, invoices, text messages, and every other document connected to the situation. Years of bookkeeping had taught me that facts are often more valuable than emotions, and if this conflict continued escalating, I wanted a complete record of what had actually happened. 2 days later, I discovered just how serious the consequences were becoming. The yacht charter company sent an automated notification to everyone included in the original email thread. Because my card had been removed and blocked from further charges, the required deposit had not been processed. The deadline to secure the reservation was set for 2 o'clock that Friday afternoon, and the account funding the event was now thousands of dollars short. Julianne panicked. Within minutes, my phone lit up with a furious message accusing me of sabotaging the entire celebration. "You are ruining my reputation with our friends," she wrote. "Authorize the payment immediately, and we'll figure everything else out afterward." I didn't argue. I didn't explain. Instead, I opened the guest list, highlighted the space where my name should have appeared, took a screenshot, and sent it back with a single sentence. "If I'm not going on the cruise, I'm not paying for the ticket." Then I set my phone aside and returned to my afternoon. The storm on their side of the family was only beginning. By late Friday afternoon, the yacht party had completely unraveled. The charter company refused to hold the reservation without the required deposit, and because the payment tied to my account was no longer available, the booking collapsed before Julianne could find an alternative solution. She spent hours scrambling to salvage the event, calling different marinas and searching for smaller boats, but autumn was one of the busiest seasons on the Maine coast. Every available option had already been reserved weeks in advance. I learned most of this indirectly. That evening, while picking up a few groceries, I ran into my neighbor Mrs. Gable, whose daughter happened to be part of Julianne's social circle. During our conversation, she casually mentioned that the entire yacht celebration had been canceled after steep fees and last-minute complications consumed the remaining budget. Julianne had apparently spent the day trying to maintain appearances while everything around her quietly fell apart. I wasn't surprised. For years, she had invested enormous energy into projecting a certain image. The yacht party had never really been about Harrison's birthday. It was about status visibility and impressing the right people. Once the illusion cracked, there wasn't much left holding the event together. That night, a new post appeared on Julianne's social media account. The background was completely black, and across the center sat a bitter message accusing unnamed people of destroying their own family's happiness through greed and jealousy. No names were mentioned directly, but the target was obvious to anyone who knew the situation. I didn't respond publicly. Instead, I printed a copy of the post, slipped it into my blue binder, and returned to reading my book. The binder was slowly becoming a complete record of reality. Invoices, guest lists, screenshots, text messages. Every accusation and every contradiction found a place inside it. The more I documented, the more clearly I saw what had actually been happening over the previous several years. My financial support wasn't simply helping Harrison and Julianne. It had become the foundation holding together a lifestyle they couldn't comfortably sustain on their own. Naturally, the story didn't remain private for very long. Within days, Julianne had begun sharing her version of events with extended family members, mutual friends, and practically anyone willing to listen. According to her account, I had suddenly abandoned Harrison, financially ruined an important birthday celebration, and created unnecessary hardship out of spite. The first person to contact me was my sister-in-law, Brenda. "Audrey, what exactly happened?" she asked carefully during a phone call on Sunday afternoon. "Julianne is telling everyone that you destroyed Harrison's birthday and cut him off for no reason." I took a sip of tea before answering. I stopped funding accounts that belonged to me after they sent me a $3,000 invoice for a yacht party I wasn't invited to attend. There was a brief pause. That's not what she told me. I figured it wasn't. Rather than arguing or trying to persuade Brenda emotionally, I simply emailed her 2 documents the following morning, the original invoice and the guest list attached to it. The response arrived later that afternoon. Brenda called me back, and the silence on the other end of the line lasted several seconds before she finally spoke. Well, she said slowly, "That's certainly different from the story I heard." That was all she needed to say. The facts spoke louder than anything I could have added. Word traveled quickly through our extended family after that. The people who had initially accepted Julianne's version of events suddenly found themselves looking at actual documentation. Once they saw the invoice, the guest list, and the amount they expected me to pay, many of them reached their own conclusions. Julianne's campaign began falling apart almost as quickly as the yacht party had. The following Tuesday evening, Harrison called. His tone was completely different from the angry confrontation in my kitchen. "Mom," he said heavily, "can you please stop talking to Aunt Brenda about our private business? This is getting really embarrassing." I sat quietly for a moment before responding. "It was embarrassing to be forgotten on my birthday 5 years in a row, Harrison." The line went silent. Then I ended the call. For years, I had been expected to absorb every disappointment quietly while protecting everyone else's image. The moment I stopped doing that, the balance of power shifted in a way neither Harrison nor Julianne had anticipated. They weren't upset because people knew the truth. They were upset because the truth made their behavior impossible to defend. By Thursday morning, the pressure had clearly reached a breaking point. A car pulled into my driveway just after 10 o'clock, and when I looked through the front window, I saw Harrison climbing out of the passenger side, while Julianne stepped out from behind the wheel. Even from a distance, I could tell neither of them had come for a friendly visit. The next confrontation was already walking toward my front door. By Thursday morning, the pressure had clearly reached a breaking point. A car pulled into my driveway just after 10 o'clock, and when I looked through the front window, I saw Harrison climbing out of the passenger side, while Julianne stepped out from behind the wheel. Even from a distance, I could tell neither of them had come for a friendly visit. When I opened the door, I invited them inside out of courtesy, but the atmosphere felt nothing like the family visits we used to have. Instead of settling around the kitchen table, they remained standing in the entryway as though they were arriving for a business negotiation. Julianne crossed her arms tightly over her chest. Harrison avoided eye contact, and both of them looked as though they had spent the drive rehearsing what they wanted to say. "We need to settle this. Today," Audrey Julianne began, her voice measured but sharp. "Your behavior is creating serious financial problems for this family. Harrison is already under enormous pressure at work, and now we're struggling to keep up with the payments on the new SUV because you decided to cut everything off without warning." I leaned casually against the kitchen doorway and listened without interrupting. "There is nothing left to settle," I replied when she finally finished. "My finances are no longer available for anyone else's use. The accounts are separate, the cards are canceled, and those decisions are permanent." Julianne let out a short, bitter laugh. "So you're really willing to destroy everything we've built together over one misunderstanding?" I didn't answer immediately because the question itself revealed how differently we viewed the situation. To Julianne, the problem began the moment I stopped paying. To me, it had begun years earlier when gratitude disappeared, and entitlement quietly took its place. "What exactly have we built together?" I asked calmly. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like I've spent years funding a lifestyle that neither of you could afford on your own." The comment landed harder than I expected. Julianne's face tightened instantly while Harrison shifted uncomfortably beside her. "You always make everything about money," Julianne snapped. "No," I replied. "You made it about money the moment you sent me a $3,000 invoice for a yacht party and forgot to include me on the guest list." For several seconds, nobody spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was revealing. Every time the conversation returned to the invoice, their arguments seemed to collapse under their own weight. Julianne recovered first. "If you don't help us now, we're done," she said. "No visits, no holidays, no grandkids. If this is how you want to treat family, then you can spend Christmas by yourself." There it was, the threat. The same emotional leverage that had worked for years. In the past, hearing those words would have filled me with panic. I would have apologized, written a check, and convinced myself that keeping access to my family was worth any personal sacrifice. Standing there that morning, however, I felt something entirely different. I felt tired. Not angry, not hurt, just tired of being manipulated. I looked directly at Harrison. Is that really your decision, too? His eyes immediately dropped toward the floor. For a few moments, he said nothing at all. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he answered, "You're not really leaving us another option, Mom." The disappointment I felt wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. The kind of disappointment that settles in after years of watching someone choose the easier path instead of the right one. I nodded, slowly walked to the front door and pulled it open. Leave. Neither of them expected that response. Julianne stood frozen for a moment before turning sharply and heading outside. Harrison hesitated slightly longer, but eventually followed her without another word. A few seconds later, their car backed out of the driveway and disappeared down the road. The instant they were gone, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The conversation hadn't solved anything. It wasn't supposed to. What it did accomplish was remove any lingering doubt about where things stood. I closed the door, locked it, and immediately picked up the phone. An hour later, a locksmith was replacing every exterior lock on the house. Years earlier, I had given Harrison a spare key for emergencies. Despite multiple requests, he had never returned it, and after the ultimatum he and Julianne had just delivered, I no longer felt comfortable leaving that issue unresolved. By mid-afternoon, every lock had been changed, every spare key had been accounted for, and the house felt secure in a way it hadn't for a very long time. The weeks that followed were surprisingly peaceful. The phone stopped ringing constantly. The angry text messages disappeared. Nobody demanded money, questioned my decisions, or treated my retirement savings as a shared family resource. Without realizing it, I had spent years carrying a burden that grew heavier every month. The moment I finally put it down, I discovered how much lighter life could feel. I used that quiet time to focus on myself. I booked a short trip along the Maine coast, reconnected with friends from my working years, and spent afternoons doing things I genuinely enjoyed rather than managing other people's problems. As the weeks passed, I noticed something else as well. My expenses dropped dramatically. My savings remained untouched, and for the first time in years, my financial future felt entirely under my own control. Around town, the drama surrounding the canceled yacht party gradually faded away. People had already formed their opinions, and most of them had done so without any help from me. The facts had traveled on their own. I didn't need to defend myself, because reality had done that work already. Then one afternoon, nearly a month after our confrontation, I found a handwritten note in my mailbox. The envelope didn't have a stamp. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Harrison. And the message inside suggested that the consequences of our standoff were finally beginning to reach him. The note was short handwritten on plain white paper and delivered directly to my mailbox without a stamp. Harrison wrote that he and Julianne had been arguing constantly since money became tighter and that life felt very different without the extra financial cushion they had grown accustomed to. He also mentioned that he missed the way things used to be, though the wording carefully avoided any real accountability for how we had reached this point. I read the letter twice while sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee beside me. Part of me felt sympathy for him because he was still my son, but another part recognized that the letter wasn't really an apology. It was the beginning of an awakening, the uncomfortable realization that actions carry consequences long after the initial conflict ends. Rather than responding immediately, I slipped the note into my blue binder alongside the invoices, screenshots, and text messages that documented the entire situation. The binder had never been about revenge. It had been about clarity. Whenever I doubted myself, all I had to do was open it and remember exactly how things had unfolded. Over the following weeks, I continued enjoying the quiet life I had rebuilt for myself. My trip along the Maine coast turned out to be one of the most relaxing vacations I had taken in years. I spent mornings walking beside the ocean, afternoons browsing small bookstores and antique shops, and evenings watching the sun disappear beyond the water. Without the constant demands, financial expectations, and emotional pressure that had once dominated my days, I found myself feeling lighter than I had in a very long time. Nearly 2 months after the yacht incident, a text message from Harrison appeared on my phone. "Would you be willing to meet for coffee?" The message was brief and noticeably different from the angry calls and accusations that had come before. There were no demands, no discussions about money, and no attempts to negotiate. After thinking about it for a day, I agreed under 2 conditions. Julianne would not be attending, and the conversation would not involve my finances in any way. He accepted immediately. We arranged to meet at a small waterfront cafe overlooking the harbor. When I arrived on the afternoon we had chosen, Harrison was already there, sitting by the window. Through the glass behind him, I could see sailboats rocking gently against their moorings, and for a moment I was struck by how tired he looked. His clothes were still neat, but the polished confidence he once carried seemed noticeably worn around the edges. "Thanks for coming, Mom," he said quietly as I took a seat across from him. I ordered tea, settled into my chair, and waited. After a few moments, he looked down at his hands. "I wanted to apologize," he said. "Not because of the cards or the accounts. I wanted to apologize because we treated you like an afterthought. We forgot your birthday 5 years in a row, and somehow we convinced ourselves it wasn't a big deal." The words hung between us. For the first time since all of this began, he wasn't defending himself. He wasn't making excuses. He was simply acknowledging the truth. "It was never only about the birthdays," Harris and I replied gently. "The birthdays just made the larger problem impossible to ignore. Somewhere along the way, you and Julianne stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a resource. I became something that existed in the background to solve problems, pay bills, and make life easier." He nodded slowly. "I know. The answer came without resistance, without justification. And because of that, I believed him." For the next hour, we talked more honestly than we had in years. Harrison admitted that he and Julianne had become far too dependent on my generosity, and that they had recently started marriage counseling because they were finally confronting issues they had ignored for a long time. According to him, the yacht disaster, the financial cutoff, and the public embarrassment that followed had forced them to look at themselves in ways they never had before. I listened carefully, but made no promises. Trust isn't rebuilt through a single conversation. It takes time, it takes consistency, and most importantly, it requires changed behavior. By the time we finished our tea, the tension that had defined so many of our recent interactions was noticeably absent. We talked about the weather, the boats in the harbor, and a few memories from when he was younger. The conversation wasn't perfect, but it felt genuine, and that alone made it different from anything we had shared in a very long time. When we finally stood to leave, Harrison hugged me briefly. "I'm going to keep trying," he said. "I hope you do," I replied. As I watched him walk toward his car, I realized that reconciliation, if it ever happened fully, would be a slow process. That was perfectly fine with me. Some things are worth rebuilding carefully, and a relationship between a mother and her son is one of them. The important thing was that the rebuilding had finally begun. Life didn't magically transform after that afternoon at the cafe, and we certainly didn't become the kind of family that suddenly gathered every Sunday for perfect dinners and heartfelt conversations. Real change rarely works that way. What happened instead was slower, quieter, and far more meaningful. Harrison began visiting me on his own once a month, and each visit felt a little more natural than the one before it. Julianne remained distant throughout that period. On major holidays, she sent brief, polite messages that never ventured beyond basic courtesy, and honestly, that arrangement suited me perfectly. The emotional and financial boundaries I had established stayed firmly in place, which allowed every interaction to happen without resentment or expectation. For the first time in years, I didn't feel obligated to manage anyone else's feelings while neglecting my own. Harrison's visits gradually settled into a comfortable routine. Sometimes we walked along the beach, discussing local events and neighborhood gossip. Other times we spent entire afternoons working side by side in my garden, planting flowers, trimming hedges, or simply enjoying the fresh ocean air. What struck me most was what never happened during those visits. He never asked for money, never hinted at financial difficulties, and never treated my generosity as something he was entitled to receive. As the months passed, I noticed subtle but important differences in him. He seemed more grounded, more thoughtful, and far less concerned with appearances than he had been before. The man who once viewed every social event as a networking opportunity was slowly being replaced by someone capable of appreciating simpler things. Whether that change would last forever, I couldn't say, but it was enough to give me hope. The following summer, my grandchildren came to stay with me for an entire week. There were no conditions attached, no negotiations, and no attempts to control the arrangement from a distance. We spent our days collecting shells along the shoreline, baking cookies in the kitchen, and playing card games late into the evening. Watching them laugh as they ran through the backyard reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten during the worst of the conflict. Protecting yourself doesn't mean giving up on the people you love. What I had learned was much simpler. You can love your family deeply while still refusing to be used by them. My blue binder remained on the shelf in my office the entire time. It was still filled with invoices, screenshots, angry messages, and every other piece of evidence from that painful chapter. Yet as the months went by, I found myself thinking about it less and less. The binder had served its purpose. It wasn't a weapon, a trophy, or a reminder of victory. It was simply proof that I hadn't imagined what happened, and that standing up for myself had been necessary. When my 68th birthday arrived the following October, I wasn't expecting much. I certainly wasn't expecting a knock on the front door at 8 o'clock in the morning. When I opened it, Harrison was standing there holding a small bouquet of wildflowers and a homemade birthday cake. The frosting wasn't perfectly smooth, and the decorations were slightly uneven, but that only made the gesture feel more sincere. "Happy birthday, Mom," he said with a nervous smile. I stepped aside and invited him in. There were no expensive gifts, no grand speeches, and no attempts to erase the past. Instead, we spent the morning drinking coffee, sharing slices of cake, and talking about ordinary things. It was simple, genuine, and more meaningful than any lavish celebration could have been. As I blew out the single candle on the cake, I realized I wasn't carrying any bitterness about the previous 5 years. The hurt had been real, and the lessons had been difficult, but I no longer needed to hold on to them. What mattered was the life I had reclaimed, the independence I had protected, and the self-respect I had refused to surrender. Later that afternoon, I stood outside looking toward the ocean while a cool breeze rolled in from the water. The horizon stretched endlessly in front of me, calm and steady beneath the autumn sky. In that moment, I understood that the most important thing I had gained wasn't money control or even vindication. It was freedom. I had kept my home. I had protected my financial independence. I had preserved my dignity. And all of it began with the courage to send exactly $1 when everyone expected 3,000. The ocean looked calm that day, and as I watched the sunlight shimmer across the water, I knew with complete certainty that whatever storms waited ahead, I was perfectly capable of steering my own ship through them. Looking back now, I don't think the yacht invoice was ever the real issue. It was simply the moment when years of small disappointments finally became impossible to ignore. The forgotten birthdays, the endless financial expectations, and the assumption that my generosity would always be available had been building quietly for a long time. The invoice just forced me to acknowledge what I had been avoiding. For years, I convinced myself that helping my family was the same thing as supporting them. What I eventually learned is that support and dependency are not the same thing. Real support helps people grow. Dependency teaches them that someone else will always absorb the consequences of their choices. Without realizing it, I had spent years protecting Harrison and Julianne from realities they needed to face on their own. The hardest part wasn't closing accounts or changing passwords. The hardest part was accepting that people can love you and still take you for granted. Once I understood that setting boundaries became much easier. Those boundaries weren't designed to punish anyone. They existed to protect my peace, my finances, and the life I had worked decades to build. Today, the blue binder still sits on the shelf in my office, but it no longer feels important. The documents inside represent a chapter of my life, not the story itself. What matters now are the things that came afterward, the quiet mornings with coffee, the afternoons spent in the garden, the visits from my grandchildren, and the slow rebuilding of a healthier relationship with my son. If this experience taught me anything, It's that self-respect is not selfish. You don't stop loving people when you stop financing their mistakes. You don't stop being a mother when you refuse to be treated like a bank account. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back and allow others to carry the weight of their own decisions. The funny thing is that people often assume strength looks loud. They imagine arguments, ultimatums, and dramatic confrontations. In my experience, real strength is much quieter. Sometimes it looks like a single dollar a short memo line and the courage to finally say no. That $1 didn't change my family overnight. What it changed was me, and that turned out to be worth far more than $3,000.
This story is a work of fiction inspired by real-life situations that many people experience but rarely talk about openly. While the characters and events have been shaped for storytelling, the emotions, conflicts, and choices reflect truths that exist in everyday life. At Quiet Revenge Stories channel, every story is created to explore the complexity of human relationships, especially the difficult moments that test trust boundaries and self-worth. These stories are not just about drama, but about awareness, resilience, and the courage it takes to protect yourself when it matters most. The message behind our stories is simple, but powerful. Love should never require you to lose yourself, and kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. Life will sometimes place you in situations where you must choose between keeping peace and protecting your dignity, and in those moments, choosing yourself is not selfish, it is necessary. If this story resonated with you or reminded you of something real, consider supporting the channel by subscribing to Quiet Revenge Stories channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, each one carrying a lesson, a reflection, or a truth worth hearing. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.